The winter of 1978 came early to Birchwood, Wisconsin, a town of barely 8,000 souls, tucked between frozen lakes and pine forests, so dense they seemed to swallow the pale December sun by 3 in the afternoon. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, your business, and what you'd ordered at the diner last Tuesday. Where Friday nights meant high school basketball games in a gymnasium that smelled like varnished wood and burnt popcorn, and where the local Lutheran church held more sway than the mayor's office. On the morning of December 19, 1978, 3 people drove away from a small ranch house on Oakmont Drive and were never seen again. Rebecca Hartley, 34, a soft-spoken elementary school teacher known for her patience with struggling students and her collection of children's books that lined every wall of her classroom. Her daughter, Emma, 11, a shy girl with thick glasses who played clarinet in the school band and spent her weekends sketching birds at the nature center. And her son, Michael, 8, a boy who never met a puddle he didn't want to jump in, who collected bottle caps and hockey cards, and who still believed, despite everything, that his father would come home someday. They left that Tuesday morning for what should have been a simple errand, driving Rebecca's brown 1976 Chevy Malibu to pick up Christmas gifts she'd ordered from a catalog store in the neighboring town of Ashford, about 40 minutes north. Rebecca had told her neighbor, Dorothy Kleinman, that they'd be back by lunchtime, maybe 1 at the latest, because Emma had a dentist appointment at 2. Dorothy had waved from her kitchen window, watching the Malibu pull out of the driveway, exhaust puffing white in the freezing air. That was the last confirmed sighting. For 45 years, the case would haunt Birchwood like a wound that refused to heal. 3 people, gone without a trace, their car vanished, their lives erased as if they'd driven into the white expanse of a Wisconsin winter and simply dissolved. Until the autumn of 2023, when a forensic genealogist in Virginia, working on an unrelated cold case, stumbled across a DNA profile in a federal database that would crack the mystery wide open. What investigators discovered would shatter the trust of an entire community and reveal that the person responsible for destroying the Hartley family had been someone they'd turned to for guidance, for comfort, and for faith. Someone who'd worn a collar and stood behind a pulpit every Sunday, preaching about mercy and salvation, while hiding a darkness so profound it would take nearly half a century to drag into the light. Every case featured on this channel represents more than just research. It represents weeks of meticulous investigation, countless hours cross-referencing records, verifying timelines, and piecing together the fragments of real lives that were stolen too soon. These stories matter because the people in them mattered, and because the truth, no matter how long buried, deserves to be told. If you value this work and want to help us continue uncovering these forgotten cases, please take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now let's go back to the beginning. The Hartley family had moved to Birchwood in the spring of 1975, when Rebecca's marriage to Daniel Hartley, a long-haul trucker, finally collapsed under the weight of his absences and her loneliness. The divorce had been quiet but painful, the kind that leaves no dramatic scars, but slowly bleeds out hope until there's nothing left to save. Daniel had been gone more than he'd been home, chasing routes across the Midwest and down into Texas, calling once a week if they were lucky, sending checks that barely covered rent. Rebecca had tried to make it work, had waited by the phone on Saturday mornings, hoping he'd remember Emma's clarinet recital or Michael's birthday. But eventually, she'd stopped waiting. She'd filed the papers in February of 1975, and by April, she'd packed up their small Milwaukee apartment and driven north to Birchwood with everything they owned loaded into a U-Haul trailer. She'd grown up in Milwaukee, the daughter of a factory worker and a seamstress, both of whom had passed away by the time she turned 30. She had no siblings, no extended family to lean on, which made the decision to move easier in some ways and harder in others. Birchwood had offered something she desperately needed after the divorce, a fresh start, a teaching position at Pinewood Elementary that paid just enough to cover a modest mortgage, and a sense of community she hoped would help her children heal from the instability they'd known. The town welcomed them the way small towns do, with casseroles left on the porch by women from the Lutheran Ladies' Auxiliary, invitations to potlucks at the community center, and a collective understanding that Rebecca was doing her best under difficult circumstances. She'd rented a small ranch house on Oakmont Drive, a tree-lined street where kids played kickball in the summer and built snowmen in the winter. The house had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with yellow linoleum floors, and a backyard just big enough for a swing set that Michael had begged for and finally got that first Christmas. Rebecca was a good teacher, the kind who stayed late to tutor kids who struggled with reading, who brought in snacks for students she knew didn't have breakfast at home, who kept a box of mittens and hats in her classroom for children who showed up in January with nothing but a thin jacket. She taught 3rd grade, and her classroom walls were covered with construction paper art projects, spelling charts, and a massive world map where students could place pins for every book they read set in a different country. Her colleagues at Pinewood Elementary described her as patient, creative, and endlessly kind. She never raised her voice, even with the most difficult students, and she had a way of making every child feel seen. On parent-teacher nights, mothers would linger after their conferences, asking Rebecca for advice, not just about schoolwork, but about life, about how she managed on her own, about where she found the strength. She'd smile, deflect, and say she was just taking it one day at a time. Emma and Michael had adjusted slowly to Birchwood, the way children do when their world has been turned upside down. Emma, who'd been 8 when they moved, had been a serious child even then, quiet and observant, with a tendency to retreat into books when things felt overwhelming. She loved the library, a small brick building on Main Street run by a woman named Mrs. Kowalski, who'd quickly learned that Emma would spend entire Saturday afternoons curled up in the corner, reading everything from Laura Ingalls Wilder to Roald Dahl. By the time she was 11, Emma had read nearly every book in the children's section and had started borrowing from the adult fiction shelves. She played clarinet in the school band, not because she was particularly talented, but because she liked the routine of practice, the way the music gave her something to focus on that wasn't the divorce or her father's absence. She was shy, the kind of kid who sat in the back of the classroom and only spoke when called on, but her teachers knew she was smart. She got straight A's, turned in assignments early, and spent her lunch periods sketching birds she'd seen at the nature center on the edge of town. Michael, 5 when they'd moved, had adapted more easily in some ways and struggled more in others. He was a boy who couldn't sit still, who was always climbing trees, jumping off things he shouldn't, coming home with scraped knees and dirt under his fingernails. He collected things obsessively, bottle caps from soda brands that no longer existed, hockey cards he'd trade with other kids at recess, rocks he'd find on walks with his mother and insist were special, even though they looked like every other rock in Wisconsin. He missed his father in ways he didn't know how to articulate, would ask when Dad was coming to visit, and Rebecca would have to gently remind him that Dad lived far away now and had a new job and a new life. Michael would nod and go back to playing, but Rebecca saw the way his face fell, the way he'd grown quieter over the years. She did her best to fill the gap, playing catch with him in the backyard, even though she threw like, as Michael would say with a grin, like a teacher. She took him to hockey games at the high school, signed him up for Little League in the summer, made sure he had friends and routines and reasons to smile. And most of the time, it worked. The three of them had built a life in Birchwood, modest but stable. Friday nights, they'd rent a movie from the general store and make popcorn on the stove, huddled together on the couch under a quilt Rebecca's mother had made years before. Saturday mornings, they'd walk downtown for pancakes at Millie's Diner, where the owner knew their order by heart and always slipped Michael an extra slice of bacon. Sundays, they'd go to St. Luke's, sit in the fourth pew from the front, and sing hymns that Emma knew by heart and Michael mumbled through. Rebecca had found solace in the church, not because she was particularly religious, but because it gave her a sense of belonging, a place where she and her children were part of something larger than their small, fractured family. St. Luke's Lutheran Church was a modest white building with a tall steeple that stood at the corner of Main and Elm. The church had been built in 1923, its wooden pews worn smooth by generations of worshipers, its stained glass windows depicting scenes from the Gospels in blues and golds that caught the morning light just right. The congregation was tight-knit, maybe 150 families, the kind of place where everyone knew who was sick, who just had a baby, who needed meals brought over after surgery. It was the social center of Birchwood in many ways, hosting potlucks and bake sales, running a food pantry in the basement, organizing the town's annual Christmas pageant. And at the center of it all was Reverend Thomas Grayson. He'd been there for nearly 12 years by the time Rebecca and her children arrived in 1975, and in that time, he'd become more than just a pastor. He was a counselor, a mediator, a friend. He was 46 years old in 1978, a man with graying hair that he kept neatly trimmed, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a voice that could calm a room or fill it with conviction depending on the sermon. He stood just under 6 feet tall, with the solid build of someone who'd grown up doing manual labor before finding his calling in ministry. He had a firm handshake, a habit of remembering everyone's name, and a way of making people feel like their problems mattered, like God was listening through him. Grayson had grown up in a small town near the Canadian border, the son of a logger and a school teacher. He'd worked in the lumber camps as a young man, saved enough money to attend seminary in Minnesota, and had felt called to serve rural communities where pastors were hard to come by. He'd come to Birchwood with his wife, Margaret, in 1966, fresh out of seminary and eager to build a congregation. Margaret was a quiet woman, pleasant but reserved, who taught piano lessons out of their home and played organ at Sunday services. They had no children of their own, a source of quiet sadness that Grayson occasionally alluded to in sermons about accepting God's plan even when it wasn't what you'd hoped for. The absence of children in their lives, some would later reflect, had made Grayson all the more attentive to the youth programs at the church. He ran Sunday school with a dedication that bordered on obsession, preparing lessons weeks in advance, bringing in craft supplies and snacks, organizing field trips to historical sites and nature centers. He started a youth group for teenagers, meeting Wednesday nights in the church basement, where they'd play guitar, discuss scripture, and talk about the challenges of growing up in a small town where there wasn't much to do and even less to dream about. He organized summer Bible camps at a cabin his family owned up near Lake Superior, week-long retreats where kids could hike, swim, and spend evenings around campfires singing hymns and roasting marshmallows. Parents trusted him completely. He was, after all, a man of God, someone who devoted his life to serving others, someone who seemed genuinely invested in the well-being of every child in his care. Grayson's sermons were the kind that stuck with you. He didn't yell or pound the pulpit the way some preachers did. Instead, he spoke in a measured, thoughtful way, weaving stories from his own life into scripture, making the Bible feel relevant to people who worked at the lumber mill or the dairy farm or the grocery store. He preached about forgiveness, about second chances, about the importance of community in a world that felt increasingly fractured. He visited the sick in the hospital, sat with families during funerals, counseled couples on the brink of divorce. He was everywhere, all the time, the kind of pastor who made people feel like St. Luke's wasn't just a building, but a family. Rebecca had turned to Grayson after the divorce, seeking counseling and spiritual guidance as she tried to navigate single parenthood in a town where most families were intact, and she felt like an outsider. He'd been patient with her, meeting with her in his office at the church once or twice a month, sometimes more if she was struggling. The office was small, lined with bookshelves full of theology texts and commentaries, a wooden desk cluttered with notes for upcoming sermons, a window that looked out onto the cemetery behind the church. They'd sit across from each other, Rebecca in a worn armchair and Grayson behind his desk, and she'd pour out her fears about raising 2 kids alone, about money, always money, stretching a teacher's salary to cover rent and groceries and the occasional treat for the kids, about whether she was doing enough, whether Emma and Michael would grow up resenting her for the divorce, whether she'd made a mistake moving them so far from everything they'd known. Grayson would listen, nodding, offering reassurances that felt genuine. He'd tell her she was stronger than she knew, that God had a plan for her and her children, that Birchwood was where they were meant to be. He'd quote scripture, not in a preachy way, but in a way that felt like he was sharing wisdom, offering her something to hold on to when things felt overwhelming. He'd pray with her before she left, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, his voice steady and calm. And she'd leave feeling lighter, like maybe she could do this after all. She trusted him. So did Emma and Michael, who attended his Sunday school classes and looked up to him the way kids do when they're searching for a father figure, someone stable and kind in a world that had felt unstable for too long. On the surface, Reverend Thomas Grayson was everything a community could want in a spiritual leader, but beneath that surface, hidden behind sermons and smiles and carefully crafted compassion, was a man with secrets that would take 45 years to uncover. A man who used his position of trust not to guide, but to manipulate, not to protect, but to pray. And when Rebecca Hartley finally saw through the facade, when she confronted him with a truth he couldn't deny, he made a decision that would destroy 3 lives and haunt a town for nearly half a century. Rebecca had found solace at St. Luke's Lutheran Church, a modest white building with a tall steeple that stood at the corner of Main and Elm. The congregation was tight-knit, maybe 150 families, and the pastor, Reverend Thomas Grayson, had been there for nearly 12 years. He was 46 years old in 1978, a man with graying hair, kind eyes, and a voice that could calm a room or fill it with conviction depending on the sermon. He'd grown up in northern Wisconsin, attended seminary in Minnesota, and had come to Birchwood with his wife Margaret in the late 60s. They had no children of their own, which made Grayson all the more attentive to the youth programs at the church. He ran Sunday school, organized summer Bible camps, and was known for taking kids on weekend retreats to a cabin his family owned up near Lake Superior. Parents trusted him completely. He was, after all, a man of God. Rebecca had turned to Reverend Grayson after the divorce, seeking counseling and spiritual guidance as she tried to navigate single parenthood. He'd been patient with her, meeting with her in his office at the church once or twice a month, listening as she poured out her fears about raising 2 kids alone, about money, about whether she was doing enough. He'd told her she was stronger than she knew, that God had a plan, and that Birchwood was where she and her children were meant to be. She'd trusted him. So had Emma and Michael, who attended his Sunday school classes and looked up to him the way kids do when they're searching for a father figure. On the surface, Reverend Grayson was everything a community could want in a spiritual leader. But beneath that surface, hidden behind sermons and smiles, was a man with secrets that would take 45 years to uncover. On the morning of December 19, 1978, Rebecca, Emma, and Michael left their house at approximately 9:15 a.m. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and a light snow had fallen, leaving a fresh dusting that sparkled in the weak morning sun. Rebecca had bundled the kids into their winter coats, Michael complaining that his scarf was itchy, Emma quietly clutching a library book she wanted to finish in the car. Dorothy Kleinman, the neighbor who lived next door in a tidy bungalow with wind chimes that rang even in winter, had been scraping ice off her windshield when she saw them pull out. She'd paused, her breath clouding in the cold air, and waved with her gloved hand. Rebecca had waved back, her face visible through the frosted window, smiling that patient smile Dorothy had come to know well. Dorothy would later tell police she'd noticed Rebecca seemed a little distracted that morning, maybe tired, but nothing that raised concern. She'd seen Michael pressing his face against the back window, fogging the glass, and Emma reading, oblivious to everything around her. The Malibu's exhaust had puffed white in the freezing air as it backed out of the driveway, tires crunching on the thin layer of snow. Dorothy had gone back to scraping ice, thinking nothing of it. She'd assumed, like everyone else would assume for hours to come, that the Hartleys were just running an errand, that they'd be back by lunch, that life would continue as it always had. She couldn't have known that the simple act of waving goodbye would become a memory she'd replay thousands of times over the next 45 years, searching for some sign she'd missed, some indication that something was wrong. The drive to Ashford was straightforward, a route Rebecca had taken dozens of times. North on County Road M, a 2-lane highway that wound through farmland and patches of forest, then east on Highway 77, which cut through the heart of Wisconsin's dairy country. In December, the fields were empty, covered in snow, dotted here and there with bare trees, and the occasional farmhouse set back from the road, smoke rising from chimneys. The roads had been plowed earlier that morning, pushed into narrow banks on either side, and traffic was light. A farmer hauling hay bales, a milk truck making its rounds, a few cars heading toward Ashford for work or errands. According to the catalog store's records, Miller's General on the edge of Ashford, Rebecca had called 2 days earlier, on December 17th, to confirm that her Christmas order was ready for pickup. The clerk who'd taken the call, a teenager named Brenda Larson, remembered Rebecca asking specifically about the encyclopedias for Emma, wanting to make sure they were the right edition. Brenda had assured her everything was ready, wrapped, and waiting. The order included a full set of World Book encyclopedias Emma had been begging for since September, a Lionel train set for Michael complete with tracks and a miniature station, and a few smaller items, mittens and books, and a new record player Rebecca had saved up for. It was meant to be a good Christmas, maybe not extravagant, but thoughtful, and Rebecca had been looking forward to picking everything up, hiding it in the basement, and watching the kids' faces on Christmas morning. But Rebecca never picked up the order. When Brenda's manager called the Hartley house that evening to ask if there had been a problem, if maybe the family had decided to come a different day, no one answered. The phone rang and rang in the empty kitchen, the sound echoing off the yellow linoleum and the half-finished breakfast dishes Rebecca had left in the sink that morning. When the call went unanswered, the manager made a note in the ledger and assumed they'd call back. It was December. People were busy. There were 100 reasons a pickup might be delayed. He had no way of knowing that Rebecca, Emma, and Michael would never call, never come, never be seen alive again. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, when Emma hadn't shown up for her 2 o'clock dentist appointment at Dr. Mercer's office on Pine Street, the receptionist, a woman named Carol Hendricks, called the Hartley house. The phone rang 6, 7, 8 times before Carol hung up and made a note in the appointment book. No show, no call. It was unusual for Rebecca, who was always punctual, always called if there was a problem. But Carol figured maybe they'd been delayed in Ashford. Maybe the car had broken down. She'd try again in an hour. But when she called back at 5, there was still no answer. By 6, Dorothy Kleinman was starting to worry in a way that felt more visceral than rational. She'd knocked on the Hartley's door twice, peered through the windows into the kitchen, and seen the light still on above the sink, exactly as it had been that morning. The breakfast dishes were still sitting in the drying rack. Michael's backpack was hanging by the door. Emma's clarinet case was propped against the wall. Everything looked normal, frozen in the moment they'd left. But they hadn't come home. Dorothy called the Birchwood Police Department just after 7, her voice tight with concern as she spoke to the dispatcher, Carol Jensen, a woman she'd known since high school. She explained that her neighbor and her 2 children had been gone all day, that Rebecca had said they'd be back by lunchtime, that Emma had a dentist appointment she'd never miss without calling. Carol took the information, writing it down in the incident log, but told Dorothy it was probably nothing to worry about yet. Maybe the car had broken down and they were waiting for a tow. Maybe they'd decided to stay in Ashford for dinner. Maybe Rebecca had run into an old friend and lost track of time. But Dorothy wasn't convinced. Rebecca wasn't the kind of person who lost track of time. She was a teacher, organized, responsible, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Something was wrong. Dorothy could feel it. By 9 that night, Officer Dale Parsons, a young cop who'd grown up in Birchwood and still lived with his parents out on the east side of town, drove out to Oakmont Drive to check on the house. He found it locked, the driveway empty except for tire tracks in the snow, no sign of disturbance. He knocked, called out, shone his flashlight through the windows. Nothing. He spoke to Dorothy, who stood on her porch in a thick robe, arms crossed against the cold, her face lined with worry. She told him everything she knew, the time they'd left, where they were going, when they were supposed to be back. Officer Parsons made notes, told her he'd follow up in the morning, told her to call if they showed up during the night. But even as he said it, walking back to his patrol car with his breath clouding in the freezing air, he felt the first flicker of unease. 3 people didn't just disappear. Not in Birchwood, not without a reason. The next morning, December 20th, the unease had solidified into something darker. Chief of Police Raymond Kohler, a man in his late 50s with a buzz cut and a gut that hung over his belt, opened a missing persons investigation at 6 a.m. He'd been with the Birchwood PD for 32 years, had handled his share of domestic disturbances and drunk drivers and the occasional burglary, but he'd never dealt with anything like this. 3 people, gone without a trace. He contacted the Ashford Police Department, who confirmed that Miller's General had no record of Rebecca Hartley coming in the previous day. The order was still sitting in the back room, wrapped and waiting. He dispatched officers to drive the route between Birchwood and Ashford, checking every turnout, every gas station, every place a car might have pulled off. But there was nothing. The overnight snow had covered any tracks that might have existed, smoothing the roads into blank white ribbons that offered no clues. By midday, Volunteers from Birchwood were forming at the high school parking lot, the same lot where Rebecca taught third graders to line up for recess and where Emma had played clarinet at Friday night football games. Word had spread through town with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. By noon, there were easily 50 people gathered, bundled in coats and hats, clutching thermoses of coffee and maps photocopied at the library. Dorothy Kleinman was there, along with teachers from Pinewood Elementary, parents from the church, neighbors from Oakmont Drive, people who'd never met the Hartleys but felt compelled to help because that's what you did in Birchwood. Chief Kohler stood on the bed of a pickup truck and outlined the search plan, his voice carrying across the parking lot. They'd divide into teams. Some would drive the back roads. Others would search on foot through the woods along County Road M and Highway 77. They'd check ditches, ravines, anywhere a car might have gone off the road. The temperature was 4 degrees that morning, and the wind was relentless, cutting through coats and gloves like a blade. But no one complained. They just nodded, accepted their assignments, and headed out. Search teams worked in shifts, their breath clouding in the air, their flashlights cutting through the early twilight that came by 4 in the afternoon. The terrain made it nearly impossible. Dense woods, narrow ravines, dozens of unmarked trails left behind by decades of logging trucks. Locals joined the effort, walking through briar and mud frozen solid, calling out names that echoed and died in the hollows. Rebecca, Emma, Michael. The names bounced off the trees and faded into silence, unanswered. For days, all anyone found were tire marks that led nowhere, a crushed soda can near a rest stop that could have belonged to anyone, and miles upon miles of nothing. Helicopters from the Wisconsin National Guard scouted from above, their rotors thumping against the winter sky, but the forest seemed to swallow every sound and scent. Dogs were brought in from Madison, bloodhounds that sniffed at the scarf Michael had left in his bedroom and Emma's clarinet case. But the snow and cold made it nearly impossible for them to pick up a trail. They'd circle, whine, and eventually sit down, their handlers shaking their heads in frustration. The investigation expanded quickly. State police brought in tracking dogs, but the snow and cold made it nearly impossible for the dogs to pick up a scent. Helicopters from the Wisconsin National Guard flew over the route, scanning the forests and fields for any sign of the brown Malibu. Local radio stations broadcast descriptions of the car and the family, asking anyone who'd seen them to come forward. Tips started coming in almost immediately. A gas station attendant in Ashford thought he'd seen a brown Chevy with a woman and 2 kids around 10 that morning, but he couldn't be sure. A hunter claimed he'd seen a car matching the description pulled off near a logging road west of Birchwood, but when investigators checked, there was nothing there. Every lead fizzled. Every search came up empty. By Christmas Eve, 5 days after the family had disappeared, the town of Birchwood was gripped by a fear that felt almost suffocating. Families locked their doors. Parents kept their children close, and the questions hung in the cold air like smoke. Where were they? What had happened? And why had 3 people vanished without a single trace? Reverend Grayson had been among the first to organize support for the search. He'd opened the church basement as a coordination center, providing coffee and sandwiches for the volunteers. He'd led prayer vigils every evening, standing at the pulpit with his hands folded, his voice steady and reassuring. He'd visited Rebecca's house, spoken to Dorothy Kleinman, and told the press that the community would not stop searching until the Hartley family was found. He'd held Emma's Sunday school classmates as they cried, told them to have faith, told them that God was watching over their friend. To everyone in Birchwood, Reverend Grayson was a pillar of strength during the darkest time anyone could remember. But what no one knew, what wouldn't be discovered for 45 years, was that Thomas Grayson had been the last person to see Rebecca Hartley alive. And the reason he could speak so calmly about faith and hope was because he already knew the truth. He knew exactly where they were. The search continued through the winter, though the brutal cold and snow made it nearly impossible. Chief Kohler worked 18-hour days, coordinating with state agencies, following up on every tip, no matter how far-fetched. He personally drove to Milwaukee to interview Rebecca's ex-husband, Daniel Hartley, who'd been working a route through Illinois at the time and had an alibi confirmed by truck stop receipts and dispatcher logs. He interviewed Rebecca's co-workers at Pinewood Elementary, her friends from church, anyone who might have known where she was going or why she might have deviated from her plans. But everyone said the same thing. Rebecca was reliable. She wouldn't have just disappeared. She loved her kids. She had no reason to run. By February of 1979, the case had gone cold. The FBI had been consulted and found no evidence of abduction or foul play beyond the simple fact that 3 people and a car had vanished. Theories circulated. Maybe Rebecca had driven off the road into a ravine that hadn't been searched. Maybe she'd been forced off the highway by another vehicle. Maybe she'd had a mental breakdown and driven somewhere to start over. But none of the theories fit. Rebecca's bank account hadn't been touched. Her paycheck from the school district sat uncashed. Her house was exactly as she'd left it, down to the coffee cup still sitting in the sink. The town eventually moved on, the way towns do when there are no answers. The missing posters faded. The search parties disbanded. Life returned to its rhythms, though the absence of the Hartley family left a hollow space that never quite filled. St. Luke's Church held a memorial service in the spring of 1979, and Reverend Grayson delivered a sermon about faith in the face of uncertainty, about trusting that God had a plan, even when we couldn't see it. He spoke beautifully, his voice breaking just enough to seem genuine. And when he bowed his head in prayer, the entire congregation bowed with him. No one suspected. No one questioned. And for the next 4.5 decades, Thomas Grayson would live with his secret, moving through life as if December 19, 1978, had been just another day. In 1985, Reverend Grayson and his wife Margaret left Birchwood. He'd accepted a position at a larger church in Eau Claire, a promotion of sorts, and the congregation at St. Luke's had given him a tearful farewell, thanking him for his years of service and his steady presence during the town's darkest hour. He and Margaret settled into their new life, and over the years, Grayson built a reputation as a compassionate, effective pastor. He retired in 2003, and he and Margaret moved to a modest home in Hayward, Wisconsin, near the lake where they'd always talked about spending their golden years. Margaret passed away in 2015, and Grayson, now in his 90s, lived alone, his health declining, but his mind still sharp. To anyone who knew him, he was a kind old man who devoted his life to the church. But the truth, buried beneath decades of silence, was about to surface. In the fall of 2023, a forensic genealogist named Dr. Emily Navarro, working out of a lab in Virginia, was assisting police in Missouri with an unrelated cold case involving unidentified remains from the 1980s. She'd submitted a DNA sample to GED Match, a public genealogy database used by both hobbyists and law enforcement, hoping to find familial matches that could lead to an identification. What she found instead was a hit on a different case entirely. The DNA sample had been uploaded to the database years earlier by the Wisconsin State Crime Lab, part of a long-standing effort to identify remains that had been discovered in 1992. Those remains, found by hunters in a remote section of Chequamegon National Forest, about 60 miles northwest of Birchwood, had never been identified. They'd been badly decomposed, scattered by animals, and initial forensic analysis in the early 90s had determined they were the remains of at least 2 individuals, possibly 3. But the technology at the time hadn't been advanced enough to extract usable DNA. In 2019, as part of a cold case initiative, the Wisconsin Crime Lab had re-examined the remains using newer extraction methods and successfully obtained partial DNA profiles. Those profiles had been uploaded to national databases, but there had been no matches. Until now. Dr. Navarro's genealogical work identified a familial connection between the remains and living relatives of the Hartley family. Specifically, a second cousin of Rebecca Hartley, a woman named Patricia Monroe, who lived in Denver and had uploaded her own DNA to GED Match years earlier while researching her family tree, was a match. The connection was distant, but clear enough for Dr. Navarro to recognize immediately that this wasn't a random hit. She immediately contacted the Wisconsin State Crime Lab, explaining what she'd found, and within 24 hours, investigators were reaching out to surviving members of Rebecca's family to request DNA samples for comparison. Patricia Monroe, now in her 70s, had been 12 years old when Rebecca disappeared. She remembered her cousin vaguely, a kind woman who'd sent birthday cards and visited Milwaukee once or twice before the divorce. When the Wisconsin investigators called her, asking if she'd be willing to provide a DNA sample to help identify remains found decades earlier, she'd said yes, without hesitation. She gave her sample at a lab in Denver, and it was overnighted to Wisconsin. By mid-November of 2023, the results were conclusive. The remains found in Chequamegon National Forest in 1992 were those of Rebecca Hartley, Emma Hartley, and Michael Hartley. After 45 years, they'd been found. Detective Sarah Brennan, who'd taken over the cold case unit for the Wisconsin Department of Justice 2 years earlier, sat in her office in Madison when the call came through. She was 43, a former Milwaukee homicide detective who'd moved to cold cases after her own sister had gone missing in the 90s and was never found. She'd made it her mission to give families answers, even when those answers came too late for comfort. When the DNA lab confirmed the identification, she felt a mix of emotions. Relief that the Hartley family had finally been found, anger that it had taken so long, and determination to find out who had put them in that forest and why. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had they ended up 60 miles from where they were last seen, buried in a forest most people in Birchwood had never even heard of? Why had the remains been scattered across such a wide area, spread over a quarter-mile of wilderness? And most importantly, who had put them there? Brennan pulled every file related to the Hartley disappearance, boxes of documents that had been gathering dust in the state archives for decades. She reviewed the original investigation, the search reports, the hundreds of witness statements, the tips that had led nowhere. She also ordered a full forensic reanalysis of the remains, looking for any evidence that might have been missed in 1992, when the technology was far less advanced. What the forensic team found was chilling. Rebecca's skull showed signs of blunt force trauma, 3 distinct fractures consistent with being struck multiple times with a heavy object, likely something like an axe handle or a tire iron. The fractures had been catastrophic, and the medical examiner concluded that death would have been almost instantaneous after the first blow. Emma and Michael's remains showed similar injuries, fractures to the skulls that suggested they'd been killed in the same manner, quickly and brutally. There was no evidence of sexual assault, no signs of restraints or defensive wounds, nothing to suggest a prolonged ordeal. Just violence, sudden and final. The remains had been buried in a shallow grave, maybe 3 feet deep, but over the years, Erosion from snowmelt and spring rains had washed away much of the soil. Animals, likely coyotes and foxes, had scattered the bones across the forest floor. That's why the hunters in 1992 had only found partial remains. The rest had been hidden beneath decades of leaf litter, pine needles, and undergrowth, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Detective Brennan started looking at the location where the remains were found with fresh eyes. Chequamegon National Forest was vast, over 850,000 acres of wilderness stretching across northern Wisconsin. The specific area where the bones had been discovered was remote, accessible only by a series of old logging roads that hadn't been maintained since the 1970s. The Forest Service had records of the roads, hand-drawn maps from the 50s and 60s when the area had been actively logged, but most of them had been abandoned and reclaimed by nature. Brennan drove out to the site herself in early December of 2023, accompanied by 2 forensic techs and a Forest Service ranger who knew the area. The access road was barely visible, choked with young pines and underbrush. They had to hike the last 2 miles on foot, their boots crunching through snow and frozen mud. The gravesite itself was marked with orange surveyor's tape left by the hunters who'd found the remains in 1992. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by white pines, maybe 50 yards from what had once been a logging road, but was now just a faint depression in the earth. Standing there, Brennan understood why the site had never been found during the 1978 search. It was miles off any route the Hartleys would have taken. There was no reason for them to have been here, no reason for anyone to search this far north and west, unless someone had brought them here deliberately, someone who knew the forest, knew the roads, knew that this was a place where 3 bodies could be hidden for decades. Brennan pulled property records for the area surrounding the forest. Most of the land was publicly owned, part of the National Forest System, but there were a few parcels of private property along the edges, old homesteads and hunting cabins that had been grandfathered in when the forest was established. One of those properties, a 20-acre parcel with a small cabin, had been owned by the Grayson family, specifically by Reverend Thomas Grayson's father, who'd passed away in 1981 and left the property to his son. Brennan felt her pulse quicken. She pulled phone records, though most from 1978 were long destroyed. She pulled land use permits and found that the cabin had been used sporadically, mostly in summer for family reunions and hunting in the fall. She pulled tax records and saw that Grayson had kept the property until 2004, when he'd quietly sold it to a developer for a modest sum. Brennan drove out to the cabin site. It was long gone, torn down when the land was sold and the lot subdivided for vacation homes that were never built. But the foundation was still there, a rectangle of crumbling concrete overgrown with weeds. And behind where the cabin had stood, she found what she was looking for: an old logging road, barely visible but still passable if you knew where to look, that led directly into the forest. She followed it on foot for half a mile, using GPS to track her position. The road curved west, then north, and eventually intersected with the area where the remains had been found. It was a direct line. Someone familiar with the cabin, someone who knew the logging roads, could have driven from the cabin to the grave site in less than 10 minutes. Detective Sarah Brennan, who'd taken over the cold case unit for the Wisconsin Department of Justice, pulled every file related to the Hartley disappearance. She reviewed the original investigation, the search reports, the witness statements, and the hundreds of tips that had come in over the years. She also ordered a full forensic analysis of the remains, looking for any evidence that had been missed in 1992. What the forensic team found was chilling. Rebecca's skull showed signs of blunt force trauma, consistent with being struck multiple times with a heavy object. Emma and Michael's remains showed similar injuries. The medical examiner concluded that all three had been killed by blows to the head and that death had likely been quick. There was no evidence of sexual assault, no signs of restraints, nothing to suggest a prolonged ordeal. Just violence, sudden and brutal. The remains had been buried in a shallow grave, but over the years, erosion and animal activity had scattered the bones across a quarter-mile area. That's why the hunters in 1992 had only found partial remains. The rest had been hidden beneath decades of leaf litter and undergrowth. Detective Brennan started looking at the location where the remains were found. Chequamegon National Forest was vast, over 850,000 acres of wilderness, but the specific area where the bones had been discovered was accessible by a series of old logging roads that hadn't been maintained since the 70s. She pulled property records and found that in 1978, the land adjacent to the forest had been privately owned by a handful of families and businesses. One of those properties, a 20-acre parcel with a small cabin, had been owned by the Grayson family. Specifically, by Reverend Thomas Grayson's father, who'd passed away in 1981 and left the property to his son. Brennan felt her pulse quicken. She pulled phone records, land use permits, and tax documents. The cabin had been used sporadically over the years, mostly in the summer, but there was no record of it being sold or transferred until 2004, when Grayson had quietly sold it to a developer. She drove out to the site in December of 2023. The cabin was long gone, torn down when the land was sold, but the old logging roads were still there, overgrown but passable if you knew where to look. And one of those roads led directly to the area where the remains had been found. Brennan knew she needed more than proximity. She needed a timeline, a motive, and ideally, a confession. She started digging into Reverend Grayson's background. What she found made her stomach turn. In 2007, 4 years after Grayson had retired, a woman in Eau Claire had come forward with allegations that Grayson had sexually abused her when she was a teenager in his youth group in the late 80s. The case had been investigated, but it was decades old, and without physical evidence or corroborating witnesses, no charges had been filed. The woman had described Grayson as manipulative, someone who used his position of authority to isolate vulnerable kids. Brennan found 2 more complaints, both from the 90s, both dismissed due to lack of evidence. A pattern was emerging. Grayson had a history of inappropriate behavior with young people, and he'd used his role as a pastor to avoid scrutiny. Brennan wondered if Rebecca Hartley had discovered something, if she'd confronted him, if that's why she and her children had never come home. On January 10, 2024, Detective Brennan and 2 officers from the Wisconsin State Police drove to Hayward and knocked on the door of Thomas Grayson's house. He answered slowly, leaning on a cane, his face lined with age. He invited them in, seemingly unsurprised, and offered them coffee. Brennan declined. She sat across from him in his small living room, the walls lined with photos of his late wife and framed certificates from his years of ministry, and she told him they'd identified the remains. She watched his face carefully. He didn't flinch. He just nodded, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for 45 years. "I wondered when you'd come," he said quietly. And then, without being asked, he started talking. On January 10, 2024, Detective Brennan and 2 officers from the Wisconsin State Police made the drive to Hayward, a 4-hour trip through snow-covered highways and small towns that looked like they'd been frozen in time. They arrived at Thomas Grayson's house around noon, a modest ranch-style home on a quiet street lined with bare oaks and snowdrifts. Brennan knocked, her heart pounding despite years of training that should have made this routine. The door opened slowly, And there he was, 92 years old now, stooped and frail, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. His hair was completely white, his hands spotted with age, but his eyes were still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at the 3 officers standing on his porch, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, not fear, just a kind of weary resignation, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for 45 years. "I wondered when you'd come," he said quietly, his voice still carrying that measured pastoral tone that had once calmed a grieving congregation. He invited them in without being asked, stepping aside to let them pass. The house smelled like old books and black coffee. The living room was small but tidy, walls lined with photos of his late wife Margaret, framed certificates from his years of ministry, a bookshelf full of theology texts and Bible commentaries. He gestured for them to sit on a worn couch, then lowered himself into an armchair by the window. He poured coffee from a pot he'd apparently just made, his hands trembling slightly as he filled 3 mugs. Brennan declined. She sat across from him, a recording device on the coffee table between them, clearly visible. She didn't need to hide it. She had a feeling he was going to talk. She told him they'd identified the remains found in Chequamegon National Forest. She told him about the DNA match, the forensic evidence, the blunt force trauma. She told him about the cabin, the logging roads, the timeline. And she watched his face carefully as she spoke. He didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly, as if she were telling him something he already knew. When she finished, she asked him directly if he had anything he wanted to say, and to her surprise, he set his coffee cup down, folded his hands in his lap, and said, "That night wasn't supposed to go that way." The confession unfolded over the next 3 hours, recorded in its entirety, witnessed by all 3 officers. Grayson spoke slowly, methodically, like a man unburdening himself of a weight he'd carried for too long. He said that in the months before December of 1978, Rebecca Hartley had come to him with concerns about her daughter, Emma. Emma had mentioned something to her mother, something that had happened during a weekend retreat Grayson had organized for the church youth group that fall. They'd gone to his family's cabin up near Lake Superior, a dozen kids and 3 adult chaperones, a weekend of hiking and scripture study and campfires. Emma had told her mother that Reverend Grayson had come into the girls' cabin late one night, after everyone was supposed to be asleep, that he'd sat on the edge of her bunk, put his hand on her shoulder, asked if she was comfortable, if she needed anything. Emma hadn't understood at the time, but the memory had stayed with her, uncomfortable and confusing. Rebecca had confronted him in his office at the church on a Monday afternoon in early December. She'd asked him directly if he'd touched her daughter inappropriately. Grayson said he'd denied it, of course, tried to explain it away as pastoral concern, as checking on a shy child who seemed anxious during the retreat. But Rebecca hadn't believed him. She'd told him she'd been doing some asking around, that other mothers had mentioned their daughters feeling uncomfortable around him, that there were whispers she'd ignored until now. She'd told him point blank that she was going to the police, that she was going to make sure he never had access to children again. Grayson said he'd panicked. He'd pleaded with her, told her it was a misunderstanding, that going to the authorities would destroy his career, his marriage, the church he'd built. But Rebecca had been resolute. She'd given him 1 day to resign and leave town, 1 day to make it right on his own terms before she went to Chief Kohler. That was on December 18th, 1978, a Monday afternoon. Grayson said he'd spent that night awake, pacing his house while Margaret slept upstairs, trying to figure out what to do. He couldn't resign. It would raise too many questions. And if Rebecca went to the police, even without proof, the investigation would uncover things he'd hidden for years. other incidents at other churches before Birchwood, complaints that had been quietly buried. He convinced himself that Rebecca was overreacting, that she'd calm down, that he could talk her out of it if he just had more time. The next morning, Tuesday, December 19th, he'd called Rebecca at home. It was early, maybe 7:30, before she'd left for Ashford. He'd asked if they could meet, just to talk, to find a solution that didn't involve destroying his life. He suggested meeting away from town, somewhere private where they wouldn't be interrupted or overheard. He offered his family's cabin in Chequamegon Forest, the same place where Emma's retreat had been held. He said they could talk there, work something out, maybe find a way for him to get help without involving the police. Rebecca, still hoping to resolve things quietly for the sake of the church and to avoid putting Emma through an investigation, had agreed. She'd told him she had to go to Ashford first to pick up Christmas presents, but she could stop by the cabin on her way back. He'd given her directions, told her to take Highway 77 north past Ashford, then turn west on Forest Road 204. He'd said he'd be waiting. He'd meet her there around 1 o'clock. Grayson admitted, sitting in that living room 45 years later, that he never intended to let her leave. He'd spent the morning driving to the cabin, stopping at a hardware store in a town where no one knew him, buying a new axe to replace one that had rusted. He'd spent hours in the woods behind the cabin, digging a grave in the frozen ground, the work slow and exhausting, his breath clouding in the cold December air. He'd convinced himself he had no choice, that Rebecca was going to destroy everything he'd built, that this was self-defense in a way, protecting himself from ruin. By the time she arrived, the grave was ready. Rebecca had pulled up in the brown Malibu around 1:15 that afternoon. Grayson was waiting on the cabin porch, and he'd waved, friendly and calm, as if this were just a pastoral visit. Emma and Michael were with her. She hadn't wanted to leave them alone at home, and she'd thought bringing them might make the conversation less confrontational, might remind Grayson that this was about protecting children. The kids had climbed out of the car, bundled in their winter coats, looking around at the forest with a kind of bored curiosity. Grayson had invited them all inside, lit a fire in the wood stove, made hot chocolate for the kids from a packet he'd brought. Emma and Michael had sat at the small table by the window, sipping cocoa, while Rebecca and Grayson talked in low voices near the door. He'd asked if she'd reconsidered. She'd said no. She was going to the police as soon as she got home. Grayson said that's when he made his decision. He'd told Rebecca they should talk outside, away from the kids, so they wouldn't overhear. She'd followed him out the back door, toward the woodshed, probably assuming they'd stand there and talk. But Grayson had picked up the axe handle he'd left leaning against the shed, and before she could react, before she could scream, he'd swung it. The first blow caught her on the side of the head, and she'd fallen immediately, crumpling into the snow. He'd hit her again to be sure, the sound echoing through the trees. Then he'd stood there, breathing hard, staring at what he'd done. And he'd realized there was no going back. He'd gone back inside. Emma and Michael were still sitting at the table, finishing their cocoa, oblivious. He said his voice had been calm when he told them their mother had gone for a walk to look at the woods, that she wanted them to come outside and see the snow. They'd followed him without question, trusting, putting their boots back on and stepping out onto the porch. He'd led them around the side of the cabin, and when they saw their mother lying in the snow, Emma had started to scream. Grayson said he'd acted quickly. The axe handle was still in his hand. 2 more swings. He said it was fast. He told himself they didn't suffer. But the truth, as he admitted to Detective Brennan, was that he'd killed 2 children to cover up the murder of their mother, and there was no justifying that. No sermon he could preach, no prayer he could say that would make it right. Grayson admitted that he never intended to let her leave. He'd spent the night before digging a grave in the woods behind the cabin, convincing himself that he had no choice, that Rebecca was going to destroy everything he'd built. When she arrived at the cabin that afternoon, Emma and Michael were with her. She hadn't wanted to leave them alone. Grayson said he'd invited them inside, made hot chocolate for the kids, and then asked Rebecca if they could talk privately outside. She'd followed him to the woodshed behind the cabin, and that's where he'd attacked her. He'd picked up an axe handle, and before she could scream, he'd struck her. He said she'd fallen immediately, and he'd hit her again to make sure. Then he'd gone back inside. Emma and Michael were sitting at the table, drinking cocoa, unaware. He said he'd told them their mother had gone for a walk and that they should come outside to see the snow. When they stepped out onto the porch, he'd killed them too, quickly, one after the other, before they understood what was happening. He said their bodies were small, easy to carry. He'd placed all three of them in the shallow grave he'd dug, covered them with dirt and branches, and then driven Rebecca's Malibu deep into the forest, down one of the old logging roads. He'd wiped it down, removed the license plates, and left it there, knowing it would eventually be found, but hoping the connection to the cabin would never be made. Then he'd walked back, miles through the snow, and driven home in his own car. He'd spent the rest of that day in a kind of daze, he said. Sitting in his study at home while Margaret cooked dinner in the kitchen, the smell of pot roast filling the house while he tried to process what he'd done. When the phone started ringing that evening, neighbors calling Margaret to ask if she'd heard that the Hartley family was missing, Grayson had felt his chest tighten, but he'd forced himself to stay calm, to act concerned, to offer to help. That night, when Chief Kohler came by the house to ask if Reverend Grayson had seen or heard from Rebecca, Grayson had looked him in the eye and said no, that he'd been at the church most of the day working on Sunday's sermon. It was a lie that came easily, delivered with the same steady voice he used to deliver eulogies and prayers. And Kohler had believed him, thanked him, asked if he'd be willing to open the church basement as a coordination center for the search. Grayson had said, of course, whatever the community needed. For the next 2 days, he'd participated in the search, stood beside the families, prayed with the congregation, and never once let his mask slip. He'd led prayer vigils at St. Luke's, his voice strong and comforting as he asked God to watch over Rebecca, Emma, and Michael to bring them home safely. He'd held Emma's Sunday school classmates as they cried, told them to have faith, told them that sometimes God's plan was hard to understand, but we had to trust. He'd visited Dorothy Kleinman, sat in her kitchen drinking coffee, listening as she talked about how responsible Rebecca was, how something terrible must have happened. And the whole time, he knew. He knew exactly where they were, knew they were lying in a shallow grave 60 miles away, knew that every search party walking through the woods near Birchwood was looking in the wrong place. He said he'd convinced himself over the years that he'd had no choice, that Rebecca had forced his hand, that what he'd done was a kind of tragic necessity. He'd thrown himself into his ministry, working longer hours, counseling more families, organizing more youth programs, as if sheer volume of good works could somehow balance the scales. He'd told himself that God would forgive him because he was still serving, still helping people, still making a difference in the community. When he'd left Birchwood in 1985 for the church in Eau Claire, he'd felt a sense of relief, a chance to start over, to put distance between himself and the crime. But the guilt had followed him. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, seeing Emma's face in his dreams. He'd stand at the pulpit on Sunday mornings, preaching about redemption and grace, and wonder if any of it applied to him. Margaret had never known. He'd kept it from her for 45 years, carried the secret alone through their entire marriage. When she'd died in 2015, he'd stood at her graveside and wondered if he should have told her, if she deserved to know that the man she'd spent her life with was a murderer. But he'd stayed silent. And now, sitting in his living room with 3 police officers and a recording device capturing every word, he admitted the truth. He'd killed 3 innocent people to protect himself from consequences he'd brought on himself. He'd spent decades hiding behind a collar and a Bible, preaching mercy while showing none. And he'd lived with it, not because he was strong, but because he was a coward. When Detective Brennan asked him why he'd never come forward, why he'd let the families suffer for 45 years, he didn't have an answer beyond, "I thought it was done. I thought it was buried. I told myself they'd never be found, and maybe that was easier than facing what I'd done." He said it quietly, almost as an afterthought, and Brennan had to resist the urge to reach across the table and grab him. Instead, she stood, told him he was under arrest, and read him his rights. Thomas Grayson nodded, accepted the handcuffs without resistance, and allowed himself to be led out of the house he'd called home for nearly a decade. As they drove back to Madison, he stared out the window at the passing landscape, snow-covered fields and bare trees, and didn't say another word. Thomas Grayson was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. His trial began in the spring of 2024, specifically on April 15th, in the Dane County Circuit Court in Madison. The courtroom was packed every single day, filled with people from Birchwood who'd driven hours to witness justice finally being served. There were teachers from Pinewood Elementary who'd worked with Rebecca, now retired, but still carrying the memory of a colleague who'd vanished without explanation. There were former members of St. Luke's congregation, people who'd trusted Grayson, who'd turned to him for guidance and comfort, now sitting in the gallery with faces hardened by betrayal. Dorothy Kleinman was there, now 93 years old and frail, but determined to see this through. She sat in the front row every day, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes never leaving Grayson's face. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Michelle Torres, a woman in her 40s with a reputation for thorough preparation and a quiet intensity that made witnesses trust her. She presented the case methodically, building a timeline that left no room for doubt. The DNA evidence that had identified the remains, the forensic analysis showing blunt force trauma to all 3 victims, the property records linking Grayson to the cabin near where the bodies were found, the complaints from women who'd come forward decades earlier, alleging inappropriate behavior that had been dismissed or ignored, and most damning of all, Grayson's own recorded confession, 3 hours of testimony that the jury listened to in complete silence, some members visibly shaken by the end. Torres called several witnesses to establish the timeline and Grayson's character. Dr. Emily Navarro, the forensic genealogist who'd made the initial DNA match, explained how she'd identified the remains and connected them to the Hartley family. The medical examiner who'd reanalyzed the bones testified about the injuries, describing how Rebecca, Emma, and Michael had each died from catastrophic head trauma inflicted by a heavy object. A Forest Service ranger testified about the logging roads near the Grayson cabin, showing maps that demonstrated how easy it would have been to transport bodies from the cabin to the burial site. And then there were the character witnesses, women who'd been teenagers in Grayson's youth group in the 80s and 90s, now in their 40s and 50s, who testified about uncomfortable encounters, about how he'd singled them out for special attention, about how their complaints to other church leaders had been dismissed as misunderstandings. One woman, Sarah Hendrickson, now 51 and living in Minneapolis, testified that in 1989, when she was 16 and attending a youth retreat at the cabin, Grayson had come into the girls' sleeping area late at night and sat on the edge of her bunk, stroking her hair and asking if she was comfortable. She'd told her mother, who'd mentioned it to a church elder, but nothing had come of it. The elder had said that Reverend Grayson was just concerned about the kids, that he took his pastoral duties seriously. Sarah had testified with a steady voice, looking directly at Grayson as she spoke, and when she finished, several jurors were wiping their eyes. Grayson's defense attorney, a public defender named Robert Klein, who'd been assigned the case given Grayson's lack of resources, had an impossible task. He argued that the confession had been coerced, that Grayson was elderly and confused, that after 45 years, it was impossible to know what had really happened. He suggested that Grayson might have been suffering from dementia, that his memory was unreliable, that he'd confessed to crimes he might not have committed simply because the police had convinced him he was guilty. But the jury wasn't swayed. The evidence was overwhelming. The confession was detailed and specific, matching the forensic evidence almost exactly. And Grayson's demeanor in court, quiet and resigned but clearly lucid, undermined any claim that he wasn't competent to stand trial. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury heard from forensic experts, law enforcement officials, and family members. Patricia Monroe, Rebecca's cousin who'd provided the DNA sample that broke the case, testified about her memories of Rebecca as a kind, dedicated mother who'd only wanted to protect her children. Daniel Hartley, Rebecca's ex-husband, now 73 and living in Arizona, testified via video link, his voice breaking as he described the last time he'd seen his children and how he'd spent 45 years wondering what had happened to them. And Dorothy Kleinman, too frail to stand for long, testified from a wheelchair about the morning she'd waved goodbye to her neighbors and never saw them again. Throughout the trial, Grayson sat at the defense table, hands folded, occasionally taking notes, but mostly staring straight ahead. He showed no emotion during the testimony, didn't react when the prosecution played portions of his confession, or when witnesses described the horror of discovering the remains. The only time he seemed to falter was when they showed photos of Rebecca, Emma, and Michael, images from happier times, before he'd destroyed their lives. He'd closed his eyes then, just for a moment, and when he opened them again, they were wet. On June 14, 2024, after just 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreman stood and read aloud. Guilty on count 1, first-degree murder of Rebecca Hartley. Guilty on count 2, first-degree murder of Emma Hartley. Guilty on count 3, first-degree murder of Michael Hartley. There was no cheering, no outburst of emotion, just a collective exhale, as if the entire room had been holding its breath for 45 years. Judge Patricia O'Connor, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a reputation for fairness, sentenced Grayson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 3 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each victim. She said that while the court recognized Grayson's age and declining health, the brutality of the crimes and the decades of deception warranted the maximum sentence. Thomas Grayson was 92 years old. He would die in prison. The day the verdict was read, Dorothy Kleinman, now in her 90s herself, sat in the front row of the courtroom exactly where she'd sat every day of the trial. When the judge read the sentence, she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for Rebecca, Emma, and Michael, the same prayer she'd whispered every Sunday for 45 years, asking God to watch over them wherever they were. Now, finally, she knew where they were, and she knew they could rest. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered, reporters with cameras and microphones, families from Birchwood who'd driven down for the verdict, strangers who'd followed the case in the news. Detective Brennan spoke briefly to the press, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that showed in her face. She said that justice had taken 45 years, but it had finally come. She said that the Hartley family deserved to be remembered not as a cold case, not as a mystery, but as real people whose lives had been stolen by someone they'd trusted, someone who'd stood at a pulpit and preached about grace while hiding the darkest secret imaginable. And she said that the case was a reminder that evil can hide behind any face, even one that smiles from a position of authority, even one that speaks words of comfort while concealing unforgivable acts. In the summer of 2024, Rebecca, Emma, and Michael Hartley were finally laid to rest together in a cemetery in Milwaukee, near where Rebecca had grown up. The funeral was held on a sunny July morning, the kind of day Rebecca would have loved, warm but not too hot, with a breeze that rustled through the maple trees surrounding the cemetery. The service was small and private, attended by family members who'd waited 45 years for closure, by Dorothy Kleinman, who'd flown in from Birchwood despite her age and failing health, and by a handful of Rebecca's former colleagues from Pinewood Elementary who wanted to pay their respects. There were no reporters, no cameras, just the quiet dignity of people saying goodbye to loved ones who'd been taken far too soon. The pastor who officiated, a young woman from a Lutheran church in Milwaukee who'd never met the Hartleys but had agreed to lead the service, spoke about the resilience of love, about how even death and decades of uncertainty couldn't erase the bonds that had connected this family. She spoke about Rebecca's dedication to her children, about Emma's quiet intelligence and love of learning, about Michael's infectious energy and curiosity. She read letters that had been written by students Rebecca had taught in the mid-70s, children who were now in their 50s and 60s who remembered her kindness and patience. And she led the small gathering in prayer, asking for peace for the Hartleys and for the strength to forgive even when forgiveness seemed impossible. Their headstones, 3 simple white markers set side by side, bore their names and a single line chosen by Patricia Monroe, Rebecca's cousin, who'd been instrumental in identifying the remains. Together again, at peace. Fresh flowers were placed at each headstone, white roses for Rebecca, purple irises for Emma because they'd been her favorite, and a small toy truck for Michael because someone remembered he'd always wanted to be a truck driver like his dad. The mourners stood in silence for a long time, the only sound the wind in the trees and the distant hum of traffic from the city beyond the cemetery walls. And when it was time to leave, Dorothy Kleinman placed her hand on Rebecca's headstone and whispered, "I never forgot you, and I never stopped hoping you'd come home." The cabin where they'd been killed had been torn down years earlier, sold off when Grayson liquidated the property in 2004. But the forest where they'd been buried was marked with a small memorial placed by volunteers from Birchwood who wanted to ensure the Hartleys were never forgotten. It was a simple wooden cross, hand-carved by a retired carpenter who'd known Rebecca from church, with their names etched into the wood, along with the dates of their deaths. The memorial was placed at the edge of the clearing, where the remains had been found, visible from the old logging road that had once led from Grayson's cabin to their final resting place. It stood as a reminder, not just of what had happened, but of the people they'd been before a trusted authority figure had betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. On quiet mornings, when the mist rises off the lakes in northern Wisconsin and the forest is still, people say you can feel the weight of what happened in that clearing. Not haunted, exactly, but heavy, like the land itself remembers. Hikers who stumble across the memorial sometimes leave tokens, small stones or wildflowers, silent tributes to 3 people they never knew, but whose story has stayed with them. And for Birchwood, the case that had haunted the town for nearly half a century was finally closed. The missing persons posters that had yellowed on telephone poles were taken down. The files that had gathered dust in the police station were archived as solved. The annual vigil that families had held every December 19th for 45 years was transformed into a memorial service, a day to remember not just the Hartleys, but all victims of violence whose cases remain unsolved. But the scar the case left would never fully heal. It became a story about trust broken, about how a man who was supposed to guide and protect had instead destroyed, about how a community's faith in its institutions and leaders can be shattered in ways that reverberate across generations. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority, about how predators often hide in plain sight behind titles and positions that afford them trust they don't deserve. And it was a reminder that sometimes the person standing at the pulpit, speaking words of faith and comfort, is the one hiding the darkest secret of all. That justice, even when it comes late, still matters. That the truth, no matter how long buried, will eventually surface. And that families who wait for answers, who never give up hope even when decades pass, deserve to have those answers, no matter how painful they might be. Even now, when people in Birchwood drive past the old St. Luke's Church, some of them slow down and remember the winter of 1978, when 3 people disappeared and a whole town lost its innocence. The church building itself stands unchanged, its white siding freshly painted, its steeple still the tallest structure on Main Street. But everything else has changed. The church has a new pastor now, Reverend Sarah Kendall, a younger woman in her 40s with a bright smile and an openness about the past that the previous leadership never allowed. She's worked hard to rebuild trust, implementing safeguarding policies that require background checks for all volunteers, mandatory reporting training for anyone who works with children, and transparency about the church's history that previous generations had tried to bury. The first Sunday after Grayson's conviction, Reverend Kendall addressed the congregation directly. She stood at the same pulpit where Grayson had preached for 12 years, and she spoke about the betrayal, about the pain, about how the church had failed the Hartley family and countless others by not listening when people raised concerns. She acknowledged the women who'd come forward with allegations over the years, thanked them for their courage, and apologized on behalf of an institution that had protected a predator instead of the vulnerable. She said that St. Luke's would not hide from its past, but would learn from it, and that the church would honor the Hartleys' memory by ensuring that what happened to them could never happen again. It was a difficult sermon to deliver, and a difficult one to hear, and when she finished, the silence in the sanctuary was profound. But when she invited anyone who needed to speak or to be heard to come forward, more than a dozen people stood, some to share their own stories of uncomfortable encounters with Grayson, others to express their grief and anger, all of them taking the first steps toward healing. The older members of the congregation, the ones who were there when Reverend Grayson led prayers and organized searches, still carry the weight of knowing that evil had stood among them all along, preaching salvation while hiding murder. Some of them have left the church, unable to reconcile their faith with the betrayal they feel. Others have stayed, determined to reclaim the community that Grayson tainted. They gather for coffee in the fellowship hall after services, and sometimes the conversation turns to 1978, to the search parties they joined, to the vigils they attended, to the prayers they said believing they were helping. and they ask themselves the questions that haunt anyone who's been deceived by someone they trusted. How did we not see it? Were there signs we missed? Could we have saved them if we'd paid more attention? Dorothy Kleinman passed away in the fall of 2024, just a few months after the trial ended. She died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 93, in the same house on Oakmont Drive where she'd lived for nearly 60 years, the same house from which she'd watched the Hartleys leave that December morning. Her obituary, published in the Birchwood Gazette, mentioned her decades of service to the community, her work with the Ladies' Auxiliary, her love of gardening, but those who knew her best remembered her as the woman who never stopped asking questions, who never accepted easy answers, who'd called the police when her neighbors didn't come home and had spent the rest of her life hoping they'd be found. At her funeral, Reverend Kendall read a letter Dorothy had written shortly before her death, addressed to Rebecca, Emma, and Michael. In it, she apologized for not protecting them, for not seeing the danger that had been hiding in their trusted pastor. She told them she'd thought about them every day for 45 years, that she'd kept their memories alive, and that she was grateful to have lived long enough to see justice done. There wasn't a dry eye in the church when the letter was finished. The town has other reminders too. The high school, where Rebecca had taught and where Emma and Michael had attended, dedicated a memorial garden in their honor in the spring of 2025. It's a quiet space near the library, with 3 benches surrounding a small fountain, each bench bearing a bronze plaque with one of their names. Students sit there between classes, reading or talking, or just enjoying the quiet, many of them unaware of the story behind the memorial. But the teachers know. And every year on December 19th, the principal holds a brief assembly to talk about the Hartleys, about the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong, about how authority doesn't equal trustworthiness, and about how a community's responsibility to protect its most vulnerable members never ends. It's a difficult conversation to have with teenagers, but it's a necessary one, and the teachers who remember 1978 make sure it happens. The house on Oakmont Drive where the Hartleys lived has changed hands several times over the years. The current owners, a young couple with 2 small children, moved in during the summer of 2024 without knowing the history. When they found out, they considered moving, but eventually decided to stay. They've planted a garden in the backyard, right where the swing set used to be, and sometimes on warm evenings, they sit on the porch and watch their kids play in the yard. The neighborhood children still play kickball in the street, still build snowmen in the winter, still ride bikes up and down the sidewalk. Life goes on. But the older residents of Oakmont Drive, the ones who remember, sometimes glance at the house and think about the family that left one December morning and never came back. The case closed, the truth revealed, but the echoes of that winter will linger in Birchwood for generations, in the faces of those who remember walking through frozen woods, calling names that would never be answered, in the small memorial cross that stands in a forest clearing 60 miles north, in the white headstones in a Milwaukee cemetery that finally give Rebecca, Emma, and Michael a place to rest after decades of being lost. The mystery that had haunted a generation was solved, but its lessons remain. About trust and authority, about the courage it takes to speak up against those in power, about how predators often hide in plain sight, using positions of respect to shield their actions, about how a moment of bravery from a mother trying to protect her child can cost everything, and about how the truth, even when buried beneath decades of lies and miles of wilderness, will eventually find its way into the light. The Hartley family's story is over, but their legacy endures in a town that learned the hardest way possible that faith in institutions must be earned, not assumed, and that vigilance is the price we pay for safety.